It didn't begin with ambition. It began with urgency, a need to survive, to build something that would last longer than the panic of not knowing where my next paycheck would come from. I didn't join the company because I saw a dream. I joined because I saw a problem I knew how to fix. Back then, there were no departments, no structure, no real systems, just potential and chaos. He had the vision, sure. But vision without execution is noise, and I became the one who turned the noise into rhythm. I built the templates. I hired the first 10 employees. I mapped the operations from scratch and handled every late-night failure that threatened to shut us down before we even got going, while he smiled for investors and posted updates about our meteoric rise. I was in the background making sure the foundation didn't crack. I wasn't in the photos. I wasn't at the dinners. But I was in every spreadsheet, every SOP, every workflow they still use to this day. I didn't need credit, I needed progress. So I stayed focused. The first time I noticed something was off, it was small. One of my workflows showed up in a team meeting presented by someone else, no mention of where it came from. I brushed it off. Maybe they forgot. Maybe it didn't matter. We were growing fast. Ego had no place in survival. Then came the skipped invites. The strategy calls I used to lead were moved to a different time. I wasn't told. I found out when decisions had already been made. I convinced myself it was a scheduling oversight, that they'd loop me back in, that I wasn't being sidelined, just temporarily passed over, but the pattern didn't stop. My insights started showing up in slide decks I hadn't seen, coming from people I had once trained. When we landed our biggest client yet, I wasn't even on the call. I was the one who built the pipeline that got us there. But when the CEO toasted the win, I was sitting at my desk, watching the Slack thread like an outsider. Still, I worked. Because I believed in the work. I believed that loyalty would carry weight eventually. That being irreplaceable would mean something, but now I see I was never invisible. I was being erased, slowly, deliberately, quietly, and at the time, I didn't know what hurt more, the exclusion or how quickly I accepted it as normal. It didn't come with a memo. No warning, no blunt conversation. Just a series of soft, intentional nudges designed to feel like coincidence. Until they did single quotes T. It started with a new face in the Monday strategy call. He was introduced as a strategic advisor, but no one clarified who hired him, what he'd be advising on, or why he suddenly had access to every project I was leading. I recognized the name, the CEO's friend from college. The kind who shows up not to build, but to rearrange things already built. He didn't ask me questions. He gave direction, and people followed. Not out of disrespect, but out of confusion, maybe fear. Titles didn't change, but influence did. Mine shrank by the week. I was still showing up. Still doing the work. Still pretending not to notice. When documents I used to own were now being reviewed by him before they hit my desk. I'd offer feedback and it would be taken under advisement. That was new. I used to give final calls, not suggestions. Then one morning, my login failed. Just a red banner across the screen saying my access was denied. I called. They said it must be a glitch. HR escalated it, promised they'd fix it, but no one ever did. For 2 days, I operated from memory and saved copies. On the third day, I stopped asking. What broke me wasn't the access. It was the calendar. I opened it one evening, out of habit, expecting to prep for the quarterly board meeting. The same meeting I had built agendas for, run point on, presented. Metrics in it for the past 4 years, it was there, same time. Same format, only this time I wasn't listed. No invite. No placeholder. No seat. I stared at it for a long time, longer than I cared to admit, as if my name might load late. As if I had been accidentally removed, not deliberately erased. That night I didn't storm out. I didn't draft an angry email or call anyone to demand an explanation. I just sat at my desk, hands still on the keyboard, and understood, finally, fully, that this wasn't some internal miscommunication or bureaucratic mistake. This was precision, a long, slow removal wrapped in plausible deniability. No pink slip. No confrontation. Just empty meetings, silent logins, and an organizational map that quietly rerouted around me. It didn't feel like a betrayal in the moment. It felt like watching someone pack your things without touching a single object. And as I sat there, it became clear I wasn't part of a company anymore. I was part of a strategy, and I was the piece they decided didn't need to exist. I didn't raise my voice. I raised my awareness. There's a moment right after the shock settles, when you realize silence isn't surrender, it's strategy. And for the first time in months, I stopped reacting. I started documenting every system I built, I had a blueprint for. Not out of paranoia, out of habit, emails, meeting notes, project roadmaps, versions with timestamps. I had the original, drafts, the iterations, the approvals. I had the receipts. At first, it felt petty, like I was trying to prove I mattered to people who had already decided. I didn't, but then I remembered I didn't need them to acknowledge anything. I just needed the record to speak louder than their memory. I called 2 department heads I had trained personally, people I trusted, people who'd grown into leaders under my watch. Both of them sounded tired, frustrated. "Everything's out of sync," one of them said. "Deadlines slipping. Redundancies piling up. Systems no one could explain anymore." I didn't gloat. I just listened, took notes, asked careful questions. They didn't know I'd been pushed aside. They thought I was on leave, that I was transitioning to something higher level. The CEO had told them I was exploring strategy. I smiled when I heard that. I guess being erased looks better when you call it evolution, but I wasn't done being useful. Just not to them anymore. I reached out to an old client, someone I'd helped years ago during a messy vendor dispute. She was a corporate attorney. Now sharp, no fluff. I gave her the outline, nothing emotional, just structure. Here's what my contract says. Here's what my role was. Here's how it changed. She responded in one sentence. "If that's all true, they owe you equity." I read it twice, then a third time. There it was, buried in the legalese I'd skimmed over years ago. A clause stating that any material change in my operational authority, without cause or written consent, triggered a compensation review. In plain terms, if they sideline me without formally letting me go, they don't get to keep what I built. Without paying for it, that changed everything. It stopped being about being left out, about feeling discarded. This wasn't personal anymore. It was structural. It was about what I could prove. About contracts, not conversations. Loyalty had been my blind spot. I thought it was armor. It turned out to be camouflage. And now that I'd stepped out of it, I saw the game for what it was. I wasn't a ghost in their system. I was the foundation. And now I had the leverage to prove it. I didn't need to hack anything. I'd built the infrastructure. And no one had thought to remove the mirrored backups I'd set up years ago, quiet safeguards I put in place. Not out of distrust, but discipline. Good systems anticipate failure. Great ones record it. So while they played Empire, I watched. From the walls. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. The CEO and his newly minted advisor started shifting resources like they were shuffling poker chips. People were let go with vague language, realignment, streamlining, performance optimization. Names I respected, teams I had personally built from scratch. Every goodbye email read like a confession, not from the sender, but the system. Morale cratered. I saw it in the internal chat logs, the patterns in file activity, the steady drop. In team output, client feedback forms started bleeding red. Response times lagged. Renewal rates dipped. The pipeline that had once been a machine now looked like a guessing game. And through it all, I said nothing. No angry emails. No anonymous tips. No social media fireworks. I wasn't interested in spectacle. I was interested in accuracy. I spent weeks assembling a file. Nothing dramatic, just facts, process flowcharts, metrics with date stamps, performance deltas before and after my transition. A full audit of strategic wins and whose name was next to each. It wasn't a story. It was a sequence. 1 sheet in that file listed every client acquisition I'd led. Another showed revenue retention models I'd authored, still in use. And at the heart of it, a clean breakdown of the clause they'd overlooked or ignored. Along with a formal notice requesting activation of my equity rights, I sent it to the board, directly. No. CCS, no commentary. It wasn't a threat, it was a reminder. I wasn't asking for credit. I was calling in a contract. I never saw the CEO's face when they received it. Never heard the scrambling that followed, but I didn't need to. People like him only look stable when they're unchallenged. Comfort makes them clumsy, and in that comfort, they expose exactly where the weight is carried and where it's always been. The funny thing is, I didn't feel victorious. I felt clean, detached, like someone putting down a burden they'd been gaslit into believing wasn't heavy. They had removed me from the room, but they forgot something. I was the room. And I just turned the lights back on. 3 weeks of silence, no replies, no acknowledgement, not even a read receipt. At first, I wondered if I'd miscalculated, if the board had seen the file and decided to bury it, pretend it never landed. That kind of silence can play tricks on your confidence, make you question the value of facts in a room where power speaks louder than proof. But I didn't follow up. I didn't push. I'd already said everything I needed to say, and I'd said it in the one language that doesn't flinch. Numbers. Then came the shift. An emergency review popped up on the internal calendar feeds I still had access to. Flag confidential, all board members present. I wasn't invited. I didn't expect to be. That meeting wasn't about listening to me. It was about comparing timelines, tracing failures, and realizing that their internal mythology no longer held up under scrutiny. Later that day, 2 people called me, both former team leads. Both had sat through the review. One of them said they couldn't explain anything, not the restructuring, not the revenue dip, not the layoffs. The other added, they pulled your documents, the originals. They lined them up against everything happening now. That was all I needed to hear. Not because it proved anything new, but because it showed me they'd finally looked. A few days later, I received the letter. Formal, clean, from legal. The equity clause had been activated. Terms enclosed. Back pay calculated, stock transferred. No emotion, no apologies. Just an acknowledgement that the contract still mattered, even if the people didn't. Folded inside the packet was another document. A request. Would I consider consulting on operational recovery? Not as a return, not as a public gesture. As an external strategist, the one who knew the system because he built it, there was no satisfaction in that offer, no ego boost. Just confirmation of what I already knew. Recognition doesn't always come when you ask for it. Sometimes it arrives through silence, in a form that looks nothing like validation, but carries more weight than applause. I didn't reply right away. I read the letter again, then set it down. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even surprised. When you strip away politics and posturing, truth doesn't need a mic. It doesn't need a stage. It just needs a spreadsheet that doesn't lie. I didn't take the offer, not because I was bitter, not because I wanted them to struggle, but because I had already rebuilt the part of myself that no title, no invitation, no payout could ever reach. What I created there wasn't about recognition, it was about reliability. Systems that held when people didn't, processes that protected when politics didn't, and I had done that not for applause, but for impact. Quiet, measurable, undeniable impact. So no, I didn't want to go back. You don't re-enter a room just because they remember your name, especially when they only remember it after everything starts falling apart. What mattered most wasn't that they reached out. It was that I didn't need them to. There's a kind of clarity that only comes when you're no longer waiting to be seen. When your worth isn't tethered to approval or status or proximity to power. I learned that the hard way, in silence, in erasure, in the pause between being removed and being remembered. But here's the truth. Titles can be handed out and taken away. Narratives can be rewritten. Credit can be reassigned. But real value, the kind that holds systems together, that builds under pressure, that doesn't collapse in your absence, that's harder to delete, if you're ever in the position. I was in. Don't rush to defend yourself. Don't scream to stay. Document what you've built. Protect what's yours. Let them replace you. Just make sure they notice what happens when you're gone.